Racist cop arrest a black judge, accuse him of stealing the car he is driving. Then he pleaded for mercy. If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing new stories here. Ashley lived in a house with many traditions and well-defined rules. She is the only child of a respected bailiff and a mother who takes great care of the family. From an early age, she learned how important it is to have order and respect the rules. However, something inside her had become different over the years. The constant presence of social differences and racial problems in the city left deep scars on her personality. Instead of creating empathy and understanding, Ashley came to have a strong skepticism and distrust in general, especially towards minorities. His uniform, always very neat and tidy, showed who he was. Every beat of Ashley's heart seemed to make a noise along with the badge she wore on her chest. That badge showed power, but it also brought with it a feeling of loneliness. Her friends respected her, but few people understood the difficulty of her strong personality. At home, Ashley shared her life with Major Paul. He was a man who had a strong presence, just like hers. Paul, an important officer, had a successful career. But his success came in harsh ways. He and Ashley were a strong duo. They were brought together by a similar idea of justice. This idea often crossed the line of what is considered right. Their love was a combination of respect and an understanding of the difficulties they experienced every day. Paul, with his great height and strong voice, was the support that helped Ashley feel good emotionally. They were a couple who bonded carefully and made thoughtful decisions. However, this strong bond also had a coldness that often hid any sign of fragility. Paul had a great influence on Ashley. Not only did he believe the same things as her, but he also added to her prejudices. Thus, they created a place where there was no empathy and compassion. Instead, there was only mistrust and judgment. Her relationship with Major Paul was both her greatest quality and her biggest problem. They came together to form a strong group. However, they also made a place where emotions were hidden because of a goal they all shared. Paul influenced Ashley a lot. Not only did he support what she did, he also made her actions seem right. This created a cycle of authority that affected how they related to each other, both inside and outside the police. One day in the afternoon, the expensive cars, large houses, and manicured gardens formed a scene that, for many people, showed security and comfort. For Ashley, these streets were a place where unseen threats could exist. Her gaze was always alert. She saw every detail. She was looking for any sign that could challenge the order she had promised to protect. It was at that moment that she saw him. He was a black man who was driving a beautiful red Lamborghini car. The sight was startling to him. Something inside Ashley stirred immediately. In his head, old and wrong ideas became stronger. This turned suspicion into certainty. Why is he here? She thought, as she gripped the steering wheel tightly. What should have been a normal situation had turned into something strange for her. It felt like a change in the order of things she thought she knew. Ashley activated the siren without thinking. The loud sound cut through the silence of the calm afternoon. A Lamborghini slowed down. Alexander, who was driving, looked in the rearview mirror with a doubtful face. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he could tell from Ashley's angry look that something was going to happen. He had a difficult relationship with the police. This was true even though he was a federal judge. The experiences he'd had in the past had influenced that relationship. He parked the car on the sidewalk and waited. Ashley got out of the car with sure steps and stared at what he wanted. As she approached, Ashley put her hand on the place where she kept the gun. She already had her own ideas about what was going on. "Documents and car license," she ordered in a firm voice. Alexander was surprised. He gave her the documents without much thought. He tried to stay calm, but felt the injustice growing in his head. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to figure out what was going on. No. But Ashley had already created the story that her prejudice was telling her. She looked at the papers suspiciously. It seemed that every word written there was part of a lie. "What are you doing with this car?" she asked coldly. Her eyes stared into Alexander's as if his presence was a challenge. "Does this car belong to you?" Alexander was beginning to lose patience. He answered calmly, but his voice showed that he was angry. "I'm going home. I've just left work. This is my car, it's true." Anger began to rise inside him. He understood that this way of treating the situation was not for a real reason, but because of the color of his skin. Ashley, however, didn't seem to understand Alexander's logic or explanation. For her, the idea of a black man driving a Lamborghini in that neighborhood was illogical. "Don't tell me lies," she said, her tone strong. "You think I don't know?" You think you can go into these neighborhoods, look at the houses, and think about the next robbery? Alexander's blood ran hot. The slander was attacking his honor. It hurt everything he had achieved through hard work. He had experienced prejudice before, but he had always hoped that, in the end, his work as a federal judge would be more important. But now, it was different. He realized that this woman was acting out of a hatred that she didn't show. It was a kind of racism that wasn't easy to change. He tried to stay calm, but the injustice was too great to forget. "You need to respect me," he replied, speaking louder now. "I'm not a person who commits crimes, and you can't treat me like that." Ashley, however, saw in Alexander's response not a real defense, but a challenge to her power. In her mind, Alexander's aggressiveness was proof of her suspicions. Every word he spoke seemed to show that she had been right all along. "Are you challenging me?" she asked, with a little menace in her voice. Without delay, and before Alexander could do anything, Ashley knocked him down with a swift and sure blow. The force of his army training was strong. Alexander, who hadn't expected it, fell to the ground. As he tried to calm down, Ashley grabbed his hands. She tied his wrists behind his back tightly. The noise of the handcuffs was loud. It sounded like a cold, merciless echo. It seemed to mark the humiliation. "You'll learn a lesson," said Ashley, with a tone of voice that showed she was pleased and dismissive. "At the police station, we'll see what's really going on." Alexander was lying on the floor, his hands bound by handcuffs. He was struggling to breathe. Fear and anger coursed through his body. How could this happen? He was a federal judge. He was being treated like a normal criminal just because of the color of his skin. Humiliation turned into a strong, calm will. It wouldn't be like that. The air in the police station seemed denser than usual. The flashing fluorescent lights and low voices created a tense atmosphere. In this place, people were judged and their futures were defined. Ashley entered the police station with firm steps. She pushed Alexander in front of her, whose hands were still tied. Alexander, for his part, was quiet and looked at everything around him with a calm that seemed nervous. He knew the right moment was coming. From the moment he was wrongly arrested, his mind had been thinking a lot, planning what to do next. The way Ashley looked and gestured coldly only made him more determined. The shame he'd been put through and the clear injustice of being accused of things he hadn't done, all of that wouldn't go unanswered. Not for someone like him. When they arrived at the police station, Ashley called her friends. She was excited to tell them about what she thought was a great achievement. "Take his papers," she ordered, tossing Alexander's papers on the table without bothering. She looked at him with a contemptuous face, as if she had already judged him in her head. "Let's find out who you really are." It was at that moment that Alexander, who had been silent until then, raised his head. He spoke calmly, and that changed the mood of the place. He said, "I am Judge Alexander Albuquerque, a federal judge." His voice was strong and calm. However, the words had a weight that immediately transformed the atmosphere. Ashley stopped for a second. The name popped into his head like a great fright. A federal judge is a person who works in the justice system in Brazil. He makes decisions in cases involving federal laws. Federal laws are those that are made by the national government. These judges help solve legal problems that happen all over the country. They play an important role in ensuring that the laws are followed. That wasn't possible. He was telling lies, that was for sure. Had she, an experienced police officer, a woman who had dealt with many criminals, made such a serious mistake? "You're telling a lie," she replied, almost without thinking, her voice becoming less confident than before. "You're trying to escape the charges." But Alexander's gaze didn't change. "I'm not telling a lie," he said, looking her in the eye. "I'm remembering everything you've done here today. Get ready to deal with the results, officer." Ashley felt a shiver run down her spine. That wasn't the answer I was expecting. The way he spoke, with a tone that sounded threatening, and the confidence he had in his words made everything seem like a bad dream come true. She looked around, trying to find help in her fellow police officers, but they too seemed unsure and doubtful. People started talking about Alexander's name. Everyone seemed to get more uncomfortable. So the police sergeant was called to check who Alexander was. When he returned with the completed paper, his expression was serious. The truth hit Ashley like a big wave. "He's telling the truth," said the sergeant in a calm, careful voice. "That man really is Federal Judge Alexander Albuquerque." At that instant, the ground seemed to fall out from under Ashley's feet. Her heart beat fast and cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She turned slowly towards Alexander. He was looking at her with a way that showed both contempt and silent happiness. "I told you so," he said, his voice almost low, but filled with a strength that could not be doubted. Ashley realized the seriousness of what he had done. It wasn't just the wrong way to act, it was an arrest that shouldn't have happened. She had acted because of very strong prejudices. She had used her power in the wrong way. Now, the person who suffered her injustice wasn't just anyone. It was a federal judge, a man with power who could end her career and her life. A feeling of dread began to wash over her, but she tried to hide it. "No, you must have made a mistake," he said, trying hard to regain control of the situation. "You behaved strangely. I was doing my job." But what she said sounded weak and worthless. Alexander stood his ground and kept looking at her. "What is your duty?" Alexander asked. His voice was very sharp, like a knife. "Do you think your job is to look down on me and attack me just because I'm a black man who drives an expensive car? Is that your job, officer? I'm the judge of this town, and you won't get away with it." He paused for a moment and let his words sink in. "I've already called my lawyers. I'm going to make sure you get the justice I didn't get today." Ashley realized that her body was trembling. She knew she was in a difficult situation. What seemed like an ordinary arrest was now turning into a major problem in the courts. Alexander had the strength, connections, and wisdom to finish the job. She could almost hear the sound of the pieces of the system starting to move against her. When Ashley arrived home that night, her body seemed to feel a heavy weight of something bad that had not yet been said. The house where she lived with Paul, her husband, who was a police officer, was very strong. The thick walls and simple furniture showed the organized life they both had. But at that moment, the shadows of the night seemed to take over every part of the place. When she entered, she heard no sound. But soon after, she heard Paul's strong footsteps coming towards the living room. Paul was a man who stood out for his presence. The time he had spent in the police had made his body and mind firm, just as Ashley's had. "What happened?" he asked, his strong voice resonating in the room. Ashley was in doubt for a moment. "I didn't know how to start. I didn't know how to tell him about the big mistake I'd made." The words were hard to get out, but she knew she couldn't run away from the situation. Paul was the only person who could help. She sighed deeply and began to tell. She talked about everything that happened when she met Alexander. She told about the violent arrest and the surprise of discovering that he was a federal judge. Paul stood still, not moving, thinking about the seriousness of the situation. The weight of Ashley's actions was bearing down on them like a big rainstorm. He understood what that meant. Alexander was no ordinary judge. He was a powerful man. He had the ability to end Ashley's career and life, and thus their lives. After a while, Paul finally broke the silence. His voice had a cold firmness and no mercy. "If he thinks he's going to finish you off, he's totally wrong," he said, moving closer to her and placing his hands firmly on her shoulders. "No one, not even a judge who works for the government, is going to break up our family. If he wants a fight, we'll fight." Paul's gaze, which was now steady, met Ashley's. He felt a combination of anger and planning. He was a man who knew how to deal with complicated problems, and this time would be no different. Ashley, who was filled with guilt and fear, felt a glimmer of hope. Paul was more than just her husband. He was her strongest companion. They had been through difficulties before. Now they were going to face more together. "We need to do something soon," said Paul as he began to think of a plan. "Alexander wants to finish you off. He will use all his friendships and his power to make you pay dearly for this way of acting. But he doesn't know who we are. No one knows what we can do." Ashley, although still nervous, began to notice a change in his mood. Fear turned to anger. She understood that she had made a mistake, but she knew that in a power struggle, winning was the only way out. It made no difference that Alexander was a judge. He was just another problem that needed to be solved. Paul moved closer and with a serious manner began to outline the first line of attack. "Let's hit him at his weakest point. He's got a Lamborghini, right? Burn the symbol of his value, break what he values most. He needs to realize that we're not making fun. Let's prove that we also have our means." The cold way she spoke was almost terrifying, but Ashley didn't turn away. She understood that this was only the beginning. Paul picked up his cell phone and started calling. Within minutes, he had assembled a group of friends ready to carry out the first attack. They rounded up trusted criminals, dangerous people who were only too happy to burn Alexander's Lamborghini for a tidy sum. The plan was put into action quickly. As night fell on the city, Ashley and Paul saw from afar the light of the fire rising in the sky. The sound of the fire burning the expensive car showed that they were strong. It was a message that they weren't going to give up without a fight. For them, this was just the beginning of a war that they knew would be long and full of danger. But Paul, who always uses reason to make decisions, didn't want to stop there. "We need more," he said, looking at Ashley again. "It's not enough to finish off the car. Let's finish off the man. He can be touched. People have secrets. Let's take his and use it against him." And so, the revenge machine began to move with great precision. Paul would use his friendships to find out things about Alexander's past. He would look for any mistake or flaw that could be used against him. Ashley, who a short time ago had been feeling sad and hopeless, was now full of desire to get things done. He knew he couldn't change his mind. He also understood that Paul was right. They had to be firm. Deep in the city, in a place where rules were just ideas, Paul activated his calls. The men he had called were people with a lot of experience in crime. They knew how to make evidence disappear, destroy things, and hide evidence. People who did wrong things and stayed hidden, away from the attention of the police, but who, for a little money, were ready to do anything. The plan was easy, but very cruel. Set fire to Alexander's Lamborghini. A shiny Lamborghini car was parked in front of the posh building where Alexander lived. Your car showed who you were. It was a symbol of your personal success in the face of difficulties. It represented your arrival at the top of society, where few black men could be with such recognition. Because of this, he would be the ideal person for it. The hours passed slowly, as if time was waiting to see the end of this revenge story. In a side street, which was dark and quiet, Paul's men waited. Their shadows moved fast. They were carrying cans of gasoline and lighters. The way they did it was impressive. They surrounded the car. The fire started with a spark. Within seconds, the Lamborghini was on fire. The orange and red flames moved under the dark sky like a scary show. Ashley and Paul from afar could see the fire burning Alexander's symbol of strength. The fire shone in Ashley's eyes. She felt happiness rising within her. The sound of the fire seemed to repeat what he felt in anger and desire for revenge. "He had to learn," said Ashley, almost talking to herself and not to Paul, as the sounds of sirens far away began to break the silence of the night. The fire was not only a destruction of things, but also an attack on people's minds. Alexander was an important man. The Lamborghini wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of everything he had achieved. Seeing that expensive object go up in flames would not only make him very angry, it would also make him feel weak. It would shake the confidence he had in himself. When Alexander arrived, he found himself in a nightmare. The firefighters had already managed to put out the fire, but the car was just a burnt-out metal structure. His heart was saddened to see what was left of the car that was so valuable to you. He walked over to what was left of the Lamborghini, looking at the ashes. The strong smell of smoke and burnt rubber permeated the air around him. He tried to understand what was happening. He didn't think it was an accident. His head was already gathering information. He was sure this was an intentional attack. The policemen who were there knew Alexander and his important position. They tried to give explanations that made sense. "It could have been an electrical problem," one of them said, but Alexander just denied it with his head. His eyes were still looking at what was left of the Lamborghini. He understood that this wasn't a coincidence or a malfunction. It was a message, and its origin was clear. Alexander stood up slowly, anger growing inside him. He was sure that Ashley and Paul were involved in this. The attack was very clear and very direct. They wanted him to know that they were ready to do anything to protect themselves. They had already declared war. But what Paul and Ashley didn't know was that this first attack, instead of ending Alexander, only increased his desire for revenge. Ashley watched from afar. She felt both joy at winning and a little worry. The fire had burned Alexander's car. However, unlike what she thought, she didn't feel total relief. The next morning, information about the fire spread quickly among the people and working groups in the city. Alexander, who used to be shy, was now the focus of people's attention. People wondered about the reasons for the fire, but Alexander knew the truth. And most importantly, he was almost ready to do something. He stayed calm during the fight at the police station. He followed all the rules and waited patiently for justice. But now, with the direct attack on his property and his life, Alexander's patience was running out. Alexander made a promise to himself at that moment. He decided that Ashley and Paul would pay. He couldn't just ignore that attack. He couldn't let their arrogance go unpunished. The revenge he had promised before now became even more personal and more necessary. While the ashes of the Lamborghini were still in the air and the smell of burnt rubber was in Alexander's mind as a sad reminder of the attack, Paul and Ashley felt no sadness or regret. Paul was sitting at the dinner table with Ashley. He began to think about the next step in his plan. "Let's not stop here," he said, his voice firm and cold. "The car was just the beginning. We're going to destroy his image and dirty his reputation until there's nothing left of this man." The plan was easy but very bad. Investigate Alexander's past and find any mistakes that could be used against him. No one gets to an important position without having marks from the past. Paul was determined to find Alexander's marks. He used his contacts in the police to investigate the judge's past. He looked through old files and forgotten records. In addition, he spoke to sources who were usually secretive. He wanted to find any mistakes that could be used. After a few days, something came up. Paul, in his non-stop search, found papers from Alexander's youth. Among the information, something sad came to light: reports of aggression against women. They were old stories that had been forgotten over time. However, if anyone were to talk about them now, it would ruin the reputation of a judge who showed himself to be someone who fought for justice. The accusations had not progressed at the time because there was no clear evidence. What's more, even though Alexander was a young lawyer, he already had a lot of influence. Paul saw this as the ideal chance to destroy the judge's good image. The 7 women who made the accusations disappeared from the news. But Paul, with his connections to people in the criminal world, knew where to find them. Ashley, now fully connected to the story, had no qualms about joining in. They started following the women. They were found one by one. Some had already moved on with their lives, trying to put the past behind them and forget their bad memories. But the offer of $40,000 each was impossible to refuse. So the 7 women were persuaded to reopen their cases against Alexander. Paul understood that what people thought was more important than reality. The charges were reopened and soon spread through the press like wildfire. Alexander, who had been seen as an example of authority and honesty, now saw his name in news stories that spoke of violence against women and the misuse of power. The damage was swift and intense. Alexander had always thought his career would be safe. When he heard about these accusations, he felt a very strong impact. He knew that the accusations were part of a plan. He knew that Paul and Ashley were involved in everything. But how could he show it? People weren't interested in his explanations or his defense. In a few days, a meeting was scheduled to look at the new charges. On the day of the hearing, Alexander entered the courtroom with a tired look that he couldn't hide. The judge handling the case was someone he knew. He was a longtime friend. But even that friendship didn't seem to be enough to help him escape the consequences he was about to face. The evidence was weak and based on accusations from a long time ago. Even so, it was enough for the system to do something. The judge didn't want to, but he knew he had to, and he punished Alexander. The decision was direct and very severe: 7 years in prison and the resignation of his position as a federal judge. For a man who had spent his life fighting for justice, the fall was enormous. Ashley and Paul watched the decision from afar. They were happy with the outcome they had helped to create. Alexander, who had now lost, could no longer attack them. At least that's how they thought. But what Paul didn't know was that even in prison, Alexander wasn't going to shut up easily. The man who had carried out the first attack with a car on fire now saw his life and career falling apart. As a result, the desire for revenge was growing inside him in a way he couldn't control. Although the system had taken away his freedom and his position of power, Alexander knew he still had something very valuable: his contacts. The world of justice was connected. Over the years, he had built up a strong network of friends and partners. There were lawyers, judges, and people from the bottom of the world who were ready to help him. And it was with these connections that Alexander began to create the boldest plan of his life. If Paul and Ashley had ended his life, he was going to end theirs too. He would do it in a way they had never imagined. From inside jail, Alexander began making secret phone calls. He used the requests he had received during years of work. The plan he thought up was easy, but very effective and dangerous. He knew that attacking Paul and Ashley directly wouldn't work. They were both ready for it. But there was one thing they loved more than their safety: their two daughters, Melissa and Amanda. Alexander would focus on his revenge against them. Melissa and Amanda, Paul and Ashley's daughters, were girls and lived under the protection their parents offered. They grew up with many benefits. They didn't know what kind of fight their parents were in. For Alexander, this was the ideal weak place. He understood that reaching out to his daughters would touch Paul and Ashley's hearts in a way that no other act could. Alexander made contact with a group that is good at kidnapping. They are men who know how to do this kind of thing carefully and without attracting attention. The plan was simple: take Melissa and Amanda and use them to get what they wanted. That would be the cost Paul and Ashley would have to pay for being arrogant and betraying others. The intention was to get them to tell the truth about the crimes they had committed against him. This included the false accusations, the fire in his Lamborghini, and the whole plan to finish him off. As the days went by, the parts of the kidnapping were planned very carefully. Alexander didn't want to take any risks. He needed to think every move through to make sure the operation would work. He knew Paul, who was a police major, and he knew that he would go after answers with great determination. However, Alexander was already one step ahead. He knew how the rules of power worked. He knew people's weak points and knew how to manipulate the situation. Finally, the night to put the plan into practice arrived. Melissa and Amanda, unaware of anything strange, carried on with their normal activities. The family home had good security, but it wasn't enough for Alexander's men. The kidnapping took place in a very precise and impressive way. Within minutes, the two girls were taken and disappeared into the darkness of the night. By the time Paul and Ashley realized that their daughters had been taken, it was too late. The despair they would feel would be too strong. The phone rang in Paul's house. The noise broke the tense atmosphere in the air. When he answered, the man's voice on the other end of the line was calm and in control. However, there was a disguised venom that he realized right away. It was Alexander. "If you want to see your daughters alive," he said, "you're going to have to confess. Say that you blamed me, that you set me up. Also, surrender to the law. If you don't, you'll never see Melissa and Amanda again." The threat hung in the air like a knife to Paul and Ashley's throats. The fear that gripped them was swift. The police, who are their own entity, wouldn't be able to help with a kidnapping that was so well planned. Alexander was aware of this, and so were they. Paul and Ashley could no longer control their lives and the place where they lived. They were in Alexander's hands. They felt weak and afraid. Ashley, who had always been strong and unemotional, began to cry. It was the first time in a long time that she had let her weakness show. The reason was simple. Her daughters' lives were in danger. Paul, for his part, remained quiet. His eyes showed the anger and fear that overwhelmed him. He had always thought that he could protect his family from any danger. But now, faced with this difficult situation, he realized that he had thought that his desire to take revenge on Alexander was less strong than it really was. Meanwhile, Melissa and Amanda were in a place that nobody knew where it was. They were physically safe, but they knew that something very bad was happening. They couldn't understand how serious the problem between their parents and Alexander was. However, they knew that they were being used in a fight that they didn't ask to be in. Every day, Paul and Ashley felt more pressure. Alexander was in no hurry. He knew that the fear was too strong and that the more time passed, the more devastated they would be. The phone kept ringing. Alexander asked for more and more details. They understood that they had no other option. If they wanted to see their daughters again, they had to give something up. After some very difficult days, Paul and Ashley finally gave in. They accepted Alexander's requests and went to the police to tell the truth. With trembling voices, they admitted to the crimes they had committed. They talked about the lies they had told against Alexander, and also about the Lamborghini fire. Every word they spoke felt like a knife cutting through their dignity and pride. But they knew that without it, their daughters would never come back. Melissa and Amanda were released soon after. They were physically fine, but they were afraid and traumatized by what they had been through. Paul and Ashley, however, couldn't rest. The confession was only the beginning of their downfall. After confessing what they had done, they would have to deal with the full force of the law, which was now against them. For Alexander, kidnapping wasn't just an act of revenge. It was also a way of showing that he still had control, even though he was in prison. He won that fight. It made Paul and Ashley recognize their mistakes and pay for what they had done wrong. Even though he was in prison, Alexander understood that the way to save himself was clear. Paul and Ashley, on the other hand, were going the wrong way. "You know what to do," said Alexander with the same expression. "You tell the truth, or your daughters won't come home." "There's no more time for jokes, Major Paul. Either you choose your career and freedom, or you choose the lives of your girls." The words reached Paul like a storm. He realized that the man on the other end of the call was serious. Paul put the phone back with a sad face and looked at Ashley. "We don't have a choice," he said, with a coldness that hid the fear he felt inside. "If we don't do what he asks, we'll never see Melissa and Amanda again. We need to admit it." The word confess sounded like poison in Paul's mouth. The next day, with a very serious and real threat, Paul and Ashley went to the police. In the question room, a deputy greeted them. He was surprised to see them there, ready to tell the truth. Paul broke the silence. He began to tell them in a strong, sad voice about each of the crimes they had committed. "We set something up against Alexander," he said, looking at the table in front of him. He couldn't look at the other policemen who were surprised. "We burned his car and paid women to tell lies about him." Every word he said seemed to take a chunk out of his soul. Next to him, Ashley was crying quietly. She tried to stay calm. While they were waiting, the police phone rang. It was Alexander. "I've received confirmation," he said, with a cold tone that sounded like a knife. "Melissa and Amanda are being released now. You told the truth, and I did what I promised. But don't forget," he continued, with a warning in his manner, "you still have a lot to do. This is just the beginning." The phone went dead. The news of Melissa and Amanda's freedom arrived shortly afterwards. Paul and Ashley felt a sense of relief that also tasted bad. Their daughters were safe, but at what cost? The cost of saving the two girls was to end their lives completely. Melissa and Amanda returned home unhurt, but a little changed. The girls, who had always lived in the protection of their parents, now realized that that security was a lie. For Paul and Ashley, the nightmare had only just begun. The next step is to deal with what will happen because of their confession in court. The day when Paul and Ashley would stand trial had finally arrived. This moment seemed like a fate that couldn't be changed. Paul and Ashley were taken to court with the help of the police. The handcuffs were tightened around their wrists. It reminded them that they were now prisoners. Ashley stood next to him. She kept her head down. Her eyes were dull and empty. It seemed that all her strength had been sapped in the weeks before the trial. As they entered the courtroom, they realized the strength of the gazes that were on them. Old friends, judges, lawyers, and other people working in the justice system were there to follow the decision. The judge in charge of the trial was a man with a serious look and a strong posture. He was no friend of Paul's or Ashley's, and there was no kindness in his eyes. "Paul and Ashley," he began, "you are here today to deal with the consequences of what you have done. Conspiring, falsifying evidence, bribing witnesses, and unlawfully setting fires. These crimes were not just against one person, but against the trust in the system they promised to look after. The evidence against them was clear and could not be questioned. Their statements had already been made weeks ago. The judge was just making official the result that everyone already knew. The recordings of the phone calls, the accounts of the women who received money, and the fire in Alexander's Lamborghini, everything was well recorded. Alexander, the real person who suffered through all of this, was not in court, but his presence was in every word and in every statement. The judge, knowing this, continued his analysis unabated. "It's not just one person's justice that has been affected," he said, with a serious tone that spread through the room. "People's trust in the justice system has also been damaged. When the people who are supposed to look after the law go against it, what is left for society?" The judge paused for a moment. He let the silence say what it needed to before giving the final decision. "Because of the crimes you have committed, Paul and Ashley, this court will sentence you to 12 years in prison," he said, certain that this was the end of a sad story full of problems. "You have broken the trust of the system you promised to defend, and now you will suffer the consequences." The two were arrested in handcuffs. Guards led them out of the courtroom. They were going to be taken to prison. There, they would serve their sentences. After Paul and Ashley were sentenced, Alexander had the possibility of going free again. The people in the room were silent as the judge spoke about his decision. "Based on the new evidence that has been shown in this case," he began, "this court accepts that Alexander Albuquerque was the victim of a plan made by Paul and Ashley, who are now both serving their sentences. Thus, this court decides to reduce Alexander Albuquerque's sentence." The words that everyone had been waiting for were spoken in the courtroom and brought a sense of relief. Alexander remained calm as the judge continued. The sentence will be reduced from 7 years to 6 months. The person will be given probation, which will be applied soon. In view of the situation and the time that has passed, Alexander will be released on certain conditions. The courtroom was quiet, but you could feel the relief. For Alexander, this wasn't just a victory in court, but an opportunity to make a fresh start. Although he knew that his image had been badly damaged, he now had the chance to get out of prison and go back to living normally. Justice, which for months had not seemed to help him, had finally shown him a path of hope. After the decision, Alexander was led out of the room. His face was still serious, but he felt a lightness he hadn't felt for a long time. When he left the prison a few days later, the sun seemed to shine in a different way. The air seemed lighter. The feeling of freedom, even a little, was very good. Alexander understood that his battle was not yet over. He would have to rebuild his life slowly, one step at a time. He would also have to deal with the gaze of a society that still looked at him suspiciously. But now he had something he hadn't had for a long time: control over his life. One of the first steps Alexander took was to seek help from the media. He knew that people's opinion was very important for him to recover. The conspiracy story and Paul and Ashley's public confession were things he could use to his advantage. With the help of his friends and the slow improvement of his image, Alexander began to think about returning to the justice system. This time, he wanted to do it in a different way. Instead of immediately returning to work as a judge, Alexander chose to take part in projects that would change the system that had almost harmed him. He began working for changes in the way internal investigations are carried out. He wanted situations like his not to happen again. This new work as a system changer gave him a different kind of power. He was no longer in court deciding cases, but he was changing how justice worked. He was forming a link between lawyers, judges, and politicians who saw him as an example of strength and transformation. Being imprisoned gave Paul and Ashley a new way of thinking about what it really means to have power. For a long time, they had thought that having power meant controlling others and forcing them to do what they wanted. But now, being trapped, they've realized that true power is knowing how to choose the right path. It's acting honestly, even when everything around you asks you to do otherwise. Ashley tried to get closer to her daughters. She knew that their relationship would no longer be the same. She wondered if Melissa and Amanda would understand why she had done it. She wondered if they would ever forgive her for putting them at such risk. Alexander had improved a little how people saw him, but the real problem wasn't what others thought. The problem was within himself. When Alexander heard about the situation of the couple's daughters, Melissa and Amanda, he felt very sorry. Did you know that even though their parents' actions were very bad, the girls were not to blame for the war the adults fought? Alexander decided to approach the girls. The first conversations were careful. Melissa and Amanda, still very affected by their parents' kidnapping and imprisonment, didn't know how to act when they saw Alexander. As time went by, Alexander began to participate more in their lives. He took care of what they needed every day. He made sure they were well fed and that they always went to school. For Alexander, looking after Melissa and Amanda became more than a duty. It was a way of feeling better. Over time, Alexander's friendship with the girls grew stronger. He became an unexpected father figure. This person gave advice and helped, but never tried to be their father. Melissa, who is the oldest, began to see Alexander as someone she could trust. Amanda, who is younger, felt comfortable around him. He made her feel safe. Alexander's life, which had suffered a lot in the past, now had a new purpose. He found in the help he gave Melissa and Amanda the true salvation he so desperately wanted. As the girls grew up with him, Alexander knew he was doing something that no plot or mistake from the past could stop. He was creating the chance for a better future, both for himself and for them. Alexander didn't just get the power back, he got something very important, the chance to recover.